So our program today is going to be about 1.5 hours. Well, that's certainly the outside of the envelope. And we're going to take a break about halfway through. And that break will consist of two components. One is that there's a video clip that we would like you to watch. It's about 5 minutes long. And then we will allocate another 5 minutes beyond that so that you have a bit of a break from me and a chance to get some refreshments. Our program for today is looking first at managing scope, if we could move that one, managing scope, and then we'll be looking at amending scope. And we'll be taking a break shortly into the amending scope component. Under the heading of managing scope, we'll be looking at superseded and deleted training products, and how we handle those is different. We'll be looking at how you map superseded training products in order to establish whether or not there is equivalence or variation from the previous versions. And both the superseded and deleted training products are, if you like, mandatory. That is, they are amendments that have been made through training.gov and reported through training.gov. But there are also amendments that you might wish to make. So we will look then at voluntary amendments to scope, where you either increase your scope or decrease your scope voluntarily, and then look at some considerations before applying for additional scope. So we'll look at the managing scope issue first, and that covers both involuntary and voluntary amendments. Then we'll be looking at amendment to scope, if we could go back a screen. So we will be looking at how to lodge an amendment application, and that is the 5-minute video clip, and Mel will be giving you a link so you can access that clip. Then we'll be looking at evidence required to support an application for amendment to scope, and we'll be taking you through the criteria from the standards for RTOs that are mandatory or that always apply if you are amending scope. And we'll also be looking at those that might apply, the sort of, if applicable, components. And we'll also touch on things like fees and other aspects at that point. And then finally, we'll be looking at some common challenges in amending scope, because although organisations such as yours who are amending scope are often experienced RTOs, there are still pitfalls and challenges that have to be faced in the scope amendment process. Supporting this session, we have a fact sheet called Transition and Teach Out. Much of what we're going to be talking about in the first part, the managing scope component, talking about superseded and deleted training products and the like, is covered in this fact sheet, and it's just been recently updated. Also recently updated is an amendment to registration application guide, and the amendment to registration application guide takes you through much again of what we're doing in this session, and so you'll find that there's a lot of crossover between what we're sharing with you through this workshop and what is available in this information here. But I do want to stress that if you've been through an amendment to scope process in the past, you need to review these documents because things have changed. In particular, TAC has streamlined the process by moving some out of consideration altogether and moving other criteria from them to the, if applicable, component. And so under those circumstances, strategies that you might have used in the past and documents that you might have used in the past now need to be replaced by these revised strategies. And that also applies to the amendment to scope application self-assessment tool. So this too has been amended to take into consideration recent changes which have been driven by the desire to make the process more accessible and user-friendly, yet of course retain the important issues of quality and validity through the process. So we, in looking at each of these topics, we will have those resources available to us, and I will cross-reference from one to the other from time to time. So let's look first at the superseded and deleted training products that if you like, the first part of the mandatory sort of changes that might occur. And here we need to consider that there are teach-out periods, and the transition teach-out fact sheet talks about this, that will vary according to the circumstances. So, for example, if a course is superseded, then you have 1 year to complete those who are already enrolled, or to transfer those who are continuing on beyond that year. So that if a course is superseded, a qualification is superseded, and then you have 1 year to transition from the old to the new. If it's deleted, then it's a somewhat different circumstance. Again, it's only 1 year for you to complete, but you don't transfer because it's deleted now, it's not been superseded. If it's a unit or a skill set or a short course or a module. But if it's a substantial qualification, so if it's a qualification or an accredited course, you have 2 years in which you have to make sure that your current students have an opportunity to complete. There's no provision for transfer in the context of a deleted course, so that it's not possible to transfer them to a new version because it's not been superseded, it's simply been deleted. In the case of an accredited course, the word that's used in either case is called terminated, and you have to check to determine, or beg your pardon, expired, and you need to check to make sure that the expired course has been superseded, in which case the superseded 1 year transfer or completion rule would apply, or if the accredited course has been deleted. So the one word expired is used for accredited courses. You need to ascertain whether it's superseded or deleted, and then apply the rules that are listed there. Under clause 126D, you must be careful that you don't have new commencements on old training products. So that fundamentally, when something has been removed from training.gov, then you cannot have any new commencements. And the clause 127 makes it clear that if a unit of competency is deleted or superseded, if it is required by another training package, maybe it's a core unit or it could be a specified elective. So the word required is important here. It's not just something that you've chosen to deliver, but if it's required, it's specified in the training package qualification rules in another training package, then the unit continues to exist for as long as it is required in that training package. So it's not all cut very simply. You have to consider these sort of rules. You can always, of course, check with TAC to get advice. And you need to go back to the transition and teach out fact sheet to make sure that you know how things are classified. But one of the ways in which things are classified is that when something is superseded, then the new version can be equivalent or non-equivalent. Under those certain circumstances, you've got to basically ask the question. We need to go on to the next slide if we can. We need to ask the question, what do we do if the superseded training product is equivalent, and what do we do if it's not equivalent? If it's equivalent, you do not have to do anything. The teach-out time remains the same, but you don't have to apply for an amendment to scope. That is automatically done by TAC on your behalf. And during the transition period, you'll have both the old version and the new version, the equivalent version, on your scope, and you'll be able to offer either. So that's an automatic process. Not only is it done automatically, but there are no from the old to the new. But if they're judged to be non-equivalent, then you have to apply for an amendment to scope to be able to deliver the new training product. And there are inevitably going to be fees involved with that, because it takes TAC time and auditor time and effort on your part to put together a case to be able to transfer. So keep in mind then that you have to ask yourself the question, is it equivalent or not equivalent? And you need to look at the declaration that's available, the information that's available on training.gov to establish how it's rated. So when it comes to those mandatory changes, you have very specific rules set down in the clauses that are there in the standards to define exactly what you need to do, and you need to go to the transition and fact sheet. When it comes to voluntary amendments to scope, we are talking about circumstances where you recognise that there's a new industry opportunity, a growth industry, or shift in industry that you could service through an addition to scope. That's a kind of new learner market, but there might also be government initiatives that you need to want to take advantage of, new developments, new infrastructure developments, those sorts of things. And so you may seek voluntarily to add to scope for those. Or you might find that there's been a loss of resources, that you lose a significant trainer, there's been a shift in the market, there's been a fall away of students, or simply that there is a kind of, if you like, residual scope where you haven't been dealing with many students at all and you want to trim your RTO back, so cleaning up your scope. So that under voluntary amendments to scope, we have removal from scope and we have addition to scope. When it comes to removing scope, you need to consider the sort of circumstances that can impact on your decision. So if we look at the next slide, you can see that you need to start asking questions about what is the impact of removing scope on our current students. Again, we would go back to the teach-out rules, but you also need to consider this particular circumstances of apprentices and trainees who are under training contracts, and therefore your decision to remove scope will have an impact on them. So you need to consider the implications for current students. You need to consider the teach-out rules so that as you reduce your scope, no students are harmed in the process. So you might actually want to consider alternative strategies to cope with change. I mean, rather than reducing scope, for example, if you have a reducing scope because of a loss of resources, is there a way in which you can access resources through maybe alternative delivery modes or through partnership arrangements with third parties? So maybe what you should consider before you reduce scope is, are there opportunities for you to retain activity within that area, but operate in a somewhat different way? Likewise, when you're managing scope to increase scope, then you might want to consider issues in terms of, is there truly a market for it? And here you might go back to carrying through a business case to establish that there is a significant market that you need to service. You need to consider financial implications, and obviously things like equipment and facilities and so on can have major implications. You need to consider staffing requirements, and the expectation from tax perspective would be that you'd be ready to run at a point of amendment, so you have to start thinking about how you're going to access the expertise that you need from a staffing perspective. You need to consider how you're going to access the necessary training and assessment resources. So you might be buying in delivery materials and assessment tools, and if you are, you need to make sure that they're thoroughly vetted to ensure that they comply with the requirements of the standards. Or you might be constructing your own training and assessment resources. It's a process that takes time. And indeed, all of these processes here take time. It's not the sort of thing that you can do instantaneously. Facilities and equipment I touched on under financial implications, but fundamentally you need to be considering, when you're increasing scope, what demand is this going to place on the facilities and equipment? And of course that will also be impacted in terms of the modes of delivery that you plan to follow. If your increase in scope changes your kind of client cohort, you need to consider whether they are bringing with them a new range of needs and new support requirements, so that as you are changing your scope and perhaps changing your cohort of students, that your RTO is ready to be able to deal with that. And of course, one way in which you can achieve that and increase your reach, it would be through third-party arrangements. And that again might be new to you as an RTO. So you need to consider those standards, particularly 2.3 and 2.4, where you negotiate and set up agreements with third parties, and you set up monitoring and quality assurance processes with third parties, so that you can be confident that what you're going to do is achievable. So when you consider across all of those general headings, you can see that there are some very specific rules that need to be applied in terms of transition and teach out. And there are a lot of considerations that you need to give in terms of either upscaling your scope or downscaling your scope. Either way, those are processes which require a good deal of consideration as you go. So we're going to touch briefly now on fees, and this is information that's can be found on page 2 of the registration application guide. But it's important for you to note that where you're looking at equivalent training package qualifications or units of competency, the process is done automatically by TAC, in effect on your behalf. You are, as I mentioned before, able to operate with either or both products during the transition period, and no fees are involved because you've not actually had to put in an application which has then had to be processed by TAC. But as soon as you go through the process of changing or amending your scope and adding scope to your qualification repertoire of your RTO, then there are going to be fees involved. And as we'll see after you've looked at the video, and after we've looked at some of the criteria, that's because there can be a range of levels of analysis that needs to be done of your application, ranging from desktop analysis, which can be done within TAC or with an auditor, or even a site visit. And so you can imagine that there are costs that need to be incurred and therefore fees that they need to be prepared to pay in order to go through those processes of amending your registration. But you'll see that the fees are on a kind of sliding scale, that fundamentally there's, if you like, an upfront fee because of the administrative and the magnitude of the exercise. And then after that, the fees are somewhat lower because what we're talking about here are marginal increases in costs. So you can see that from that we are talking about a set of procedures which are now well defined, have been well defined, but have been redefined in terms of your amendment to registration. And much of that information you'll find from the transition and teach out fact sheet and the amendment to registration application guide. After the video, which we're going to ask you to look at now, and after a short break, what we're going to do is resume and have a look at the particular criteria that are involved. So going back, I'm not asking Mel to go back, but going back to our earlier slide, we're going to be looking at the evidence that you need to prepare, and what form that evidence needs to take, the sort of processes that are involved with TAC and auditors in analysing the evidence you've provided, and then we'll look at some common challenges to the process of amending scope that have been observed over the past few years through TAC's experience in dealing with these. So what we're going to do now is direct you to a link which talks about how to lodge an amendment application. Now, basically what this link does is takes you into a kind of movie show of what happens on the screen. So you'll see the different screens that are involved in lodging an application. You'll see a cursor moving around the screens making selections, and you'll find that there's text associated with each screen which tells you what's happening and why it's happening that way. And this is a link you can go to at any time, so that it's not. It is a kind of unstoppable movie as we start, and as you'll see it at the first time. But you can come back to this again and again, and have a look at the go through the same link and have a look at the same information to remind you. I might say that it all makes very clear sense in terms of the process. But it's a good thing for you to have a chance to look at this as we go. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you've had a chance to look at the video and also to have a little bit of a break. So we've been looking at amendments to scope. An amendment to scope covers both deletion and expansion of your scope. So that it's the sort of thing we referred in an earlier slide to tidying up. Clearly, when you're looking at deleting scope, it's because there's been a shift in circumstances. Maybe the take up by students has fallen away, or maybe you've lost resources, or whatever. A reduction in scope does not incur a fee. You still go through, as you saw with the video, you still go through and complete the amendment application, but the amendment application only goes so far as you listing the units or qualifications that you want to take from scope, and there is no fee associated with that. So the word amendment to scope covers both an increase in your scope and a decrease in your scope. From our discussions from here on, we're only looking at circumstances where you're increasing scope. And so we're looking at the amendment to scope process and the fact that as you increase scope, you're going to have to go through a process of establishing that your organisation is capable of delivering that. And that does mean that you have to demonstrate in relation to the new scope that you're adding, be it a non-superseded version of an old qualification that you've delivered in the past, or an entirely new qualification for your RTO. Under those circumstances, you need to establish through processes not unlike those of initial registration that you're ready to deliver. But of course, it's not like initial registration. You're an RTO that's been running for many years and you've established a reputation and processes and so on. So there are selected standards that you need to attend to. So the first thing you need to do is to establish which criteria apply to you. And we'll come back to that in a moment, because in the next slide, which we'll move to in a minute, you'll see that there are some which apply to everybody and some that are if applicable, and we will look at those in a moment. Then you need to gather digital versions of the evidence needed to demonstrate compliance with the criteria. We say digital because we would expect you to transfer this information to TAC, and then possibly, if an auditor is involved, onto an auditor, and clearly that's best handled in digital form. So you need to go through the same sort of process as you've always done from the beginning of your life as an RTO, of building up a body of evidence in relation to the criteria that apply to you. But you need then to prepare a mapping of criteria and evidence to assist an auditor to verify compliance if an auditor is going to be involved. We'll come back to that notion in a moment. But first, let's look at the criteria that you need to consider in amending scope. And so we have a set of mandatory clauses, and these are parts of primarily Standard 1 and some parts of Standard 5. So within Standard 1, you clearly, for the new training product, need to have training and assessment strategy. You need to have indications of the amount of training involved for the cohort of students. It may be, if you've got multiple cohorts, that you'll have multiple training assessment strategy documents. And I refer you to a previous webinar on training and assessment strategies that talks about that particular issue. You need to be able to show under 1.3 that you have access to the resources you need, that is the personnel, the student support services, the training and assessment resources, and facilities and equipment. Under 1.5 and 1.6, you need to be able to demonstrate that as you move into this new area in your scope, or this revised area in your scope, if it's a non-superseded, if it's a superseded but not equivalent course, then what you need to be able to do is to show that you've gone through the necessary industry engagement and industry consultation processes. First, that you've got a range of strategies. Second, that those strategies and that information derived from that industry engagement has informed your decisions about your modes of delivery and content and the like. Then you need to reconsider whether or not your new cohort of students has new needs in terms of support. So standard 1.7 looks at the sort of support services that you're providing. And given that you're moving into new scope, there may be new demands in that respect. Clearly, when we look at 1.8 and 1.9, we're looking at the new assessments tools and strategies that you're going to be implementing, and 1.9 looks at the way in which you incorporate those new resources into your validation processes that are covered under 1.9. And then 1.13, 1.14 and 1.16 relate to the staff that you're going to need to bring to bear to be able to deliver those new products. 5.1 and 5.3 talks about information that you're going to provide to students, not the marketing of your RTO that's covered in Standard 4, but the specific information you're going to provide to students in relation to the new scope. And so under 5.1, you talk about information that you're going to be providing so that they can, your potential students can make wise choices about what you're now offering. And 5.3 talks about fees and other information that you need to make sure you're providing to students. So you can see that if we look at this, it's well stripped down from the whole of Standard 1. It's only parts of Standard 1 and only parts of Standard 5. But depending on your plans, there could be some other clauses that are applicable. And so, for example, if you don't have qualified trainers and assessors that are going to be utilising people working under supervision, then 117 to 120 would apply. If you are going to be offering assessment-only services, then 115 would apply. If you're going to be delivering training in the TAE area, then 122 to 125 would apply. If you're going to be using third-party providers, then you need to look at 2.3 and 2.4. There are other bits as well, but they're covered under general headings. So parts of Standard 8, for example, also relate to third-party provision. But 2.3 and 2.4, which talks about the contractual arrangements that you're going to have with third parties and how you're going to monitor those contractual arrangements to make sure that there is compliance with the standards, is something you would need to talk about if your new scope involves third-party providers. If your new scope is going to involve fees that are more than $1,500, then prepaid fees more than that, then you need to have a look at how you're going to protect those. So you go to Standard 7.3, and if you're going to be dealing with a cohort of students who are under 18 years of age, then Standard 8.5 would be invoked, because you would need to be able to establish that the necessary working with children police clearances have been provided. So you can see that most of the time you'll be able to operate with a very small set of criteria, a very targeted set of criteria, and then there'll be some where applicable clauses that apply. That's not to say that it's not possible for TAC to ask for additional information, certainly within TAC's remit and ability to ask for additional information over this, but fundamentally those are the criteria that you would need to have prepared evidence for. So when it comes to evidence, the sort of evidence that you need to provide are, again, not unlike the evidence that you would have provided in case of initial registration. Clearly documents, and best if they're in digital form. Photographs, again in digital form, which could be photographs of facilities, photographs of equipment, various photographs of resources. And in many cases, documents and photographs tell us what we need to know. Keep in mind, this is an amendment to scope. So you're an RTO already known to TAC and already known to auditors within TAC, and therefore it's not too difficult for us to imagine and understand how this amendment to scope is going to fit in with as an RTO. But if the scope change is significant in terms of a new direction for you as an RTO, or if there are issues that need a particular attention, then that may lead on to site visits and interviews. So it's not always the case that there will be site visits and interviews. It'll be where you're going into an area of some risk, or where you're going into an area that's new, or for any other reason that TAC feels that a site visit would help TAC make its decision in terms of your application for amendment. And this is covered in pages 6 to 8 of the application guide, and it talks a bit more in terms of detail there. But the decision about what depth, if you like, of audit that's involved depends a good deal on a risk assessment. And we can see that in the next slide, where fundamentally the question that the risk assessment asks is, do you need an audit at all, or do you need a desk audit, or do you need in addition a site visit? And the circumstance where no audit at all might be required is all we've already talked about. For example, where the new course superseding the old one is deemed to be equivalent to the old, no audit is conducted at all. Where they're not equivalent, then there will probably need to be a desk audit at least. But in the circumstances where there are significant risks and significant changes, then a site visit would be involved as well. So audits themselves can be done as a desk audit, which is done entirely through paperwork and through emails and perhaps through telephone, but fundamentally communication at a distance, and the audit is conducted in part through TAC and in part through an auditor as a desk audit, or a site audit, in which case an auditor may be accompanied by somebody from TAC, will be visiting your site to look at physical facilities and resources, interview staff and the like. So you can see that the amendment to scope process can be quick if it doesn't involve any kind of audit, or if it only involves a desk audit, or it could be quite extended. And particularly if there is an issue with non-compliance. If there are issues with non-compliances, then the audit process and decision-making process clearly will become more extensive. So that does mean you need to think about planning ahead. When you start thinking about your annual renewal of your registration, or annual review of your registration, you need to think not only about things you're going to delete, because it's no use having them on your scope and paying fees to have them on your scope if you don't actually want to use them. And you need to think well ahead of time of additions to scope, because the process sometimes can be quick and sometimes will be slow, depending on how well prepared you are and the magnitude of the change that you're making. So do keep in mind that the process is of variable length. We can't predict precisely how long it will take, particularly if non-compliances kick in. And non-compliances, I might say, are not uncommon. A recent review that was done by TAC of the areas of non-compliance identified the main areas of non-compliance. And if you look at, for example, assessment, covered under clause 1.8, of the non-compliances that have been observed, 36% of them relate to standard 1.8, and issues around standard 1.8. So that what you see there is that although we're dealing in amendment to scope with mature RTOs, there are still challenges and issues that people face within the context of assessment. Amount of training and the determination of the amount of training and the reporting of the amount of training non-compliances are experienced around about 25% of the time. I'm not saying 25% of the applications, I mean 25% of applications with non-compliances have non-compliances in the area of amount of training. And when it comes to monitoring and third-party arrangements, around about 21% of non-compliances that occur with amendment to scope relate to how third-party arrangements are managed and monitored in relation to clause 2.4. And finally, although there's a long list of areas of non-compliance, these are the most severe ones, around about 20% of the time there are problems and non-compliances in relation to how the protection of prepaid fees are managed. So you can see that the time that you spend in developing a case for amendment to scope, developing detailed documentation, mapping that documentation to the relevant clauses, and of course knowing which are the relevant clauses to you and focusing on those, is time that you need to spend in order to streamline the process and be assured that the amendment to scope will go through smoothly. But if you do find that there are some glitches, then you need to think a bit about the education programs run by TAC. You need to think about the extensive range of fact sheets provided by TAC. You need to look at things like the user guide to the standards that has been recently revised by TAC. All of these resources should help you to deal with these issues, both in avoiding these as non-compliances and then responding to non-compliances should they occur. So we wish you all the best in relation to your application for amendment to scope. Do understand that that it's a process that requires the same kind of rigor, the same kind of care and the same kind of analysis as your initial application, because at the end of the day, the process is all about the provision of quality training services, and that is in the interest of yourself as an RTO and in the interest of the community and industry and the vets system generally. So all the best with your applications for amendment scope. If there aren't any questions, can we ask you to direct them through to TAC? There's an email address there. And also draw your attention to the references and resources which I've just touched on. But as you can see from the next screen, there are a huge number of fact sheets involved. Deidre has asked a question: should the mapping be to the standards or the sections of the self-assessment form? It's fundamentally to the standards. When an auditor is looking at them, they're going to be looking at the standards. The self-assessment tool, which is this document here, it provides you with a kind of gentle way of considering all of the sorts of issues and questions and evidence that you might need to provide. But some of the time, as you can see from the third column on this, some things are not applicable. And basically what this is a kind of prompt document that prompts you to think, is this something I need to describe? If you were using it in this form, then you need to make sure that there's a mapping back to the specific clauses, because fundamentally as an auditor, we are required to reflect on your compliance with each clause. So fundamentally we need to be able to say this particular clause is compliant or not compliant, and this is the evidence that we saw, and this is the reason for the opinion that we have about compliance. So it really is critical that you provide the auditor with a mapping. So if you structure it according to this, then you need to make sure it's mapped back, each bit of evidence is mapped back to the clauses. If you structure it by the clauses, the mapping is not so much of an issue, but then we need to know which evidence you want us to view in relation to each clause. So either way, there's going to need to be some form of mapping which helps the auditor to understand the case you're making and to respect the effort that you've put in to making that case by being able to see the relationship between the clauses which define compliance and the evidence which demonstrates compliance that you've prepared. You'll see here, of course, that their references and resources refer considerably to the TAC fact sheets, and this is a selection from the TAC fact sheets that relate to amendment to scope. But do keep in mind that if you go to the TAC website, you will find a full set of TAC fact sheets. There's probably twice as many as we're seeing on the screen. because TAC has put a lot of effort into building a very strong set of resources for you to access, dealing with pretty well every aspect of the process of registration and amendment to registration that you might go through. And then finally, of course, do keep in mind that TAC is an organisation that welcomes your questions and welcomes your input. And so there are contact details on the last slide in terms of email and web information that you can access in order to make sure that you are given the necessary support through the process. All of these documents and the fact sheets are available on the web. They were updated about a day ago. So please don't rely on documents that you printed off last week. It's only in the last, today's Tuesday, isn't it? Hang on, is today Tuesday or Monday? I've forgotten. It's Tuesday. Thank you very much. It's Tuesday. And I think these were updated on Friday. So if you've got documents that you printed out prior to Friday last week, they will be out of date. And you need to make sure that you update your documentation and advise your colleagues that this documentation has been updated to reflect the latest thinking and the most streamlined processes for you achieving amendment to scope. Thank you very much for participating. It's been, although I much prefer to talk to people face to face, it's really lovely to know that you've been there. And please make sure that you let Mel know your full name if you've just been using your first name, so that she can issue you with a certificate of participation. Thank you very much.